Welcome everyone to CBC North's Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action Town Hall. I'm Juanita Taylor.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. I'm Loren McGinnis. I'm going to be co-hosting this evening's event with Juanita. And once again, put your hands together for the Yellowknives Dene First Nation drummers. Brent Betsina leading tonight. It's tricky. We're trying to do something really meaningful for this live audience here and also for a radio audience and a live Facebook audience. So we appreciate the drummers' flexibility and for being here and being part of that. And for opening this, it helps us to acknowledge properly and deeply where we are, where we're having this event, where we're living and doing our work. And so I want to move from that drumming into an acknowledgement that we are on Yellowknives Dene territory, Chief Dry Geese lands. We are all treaty people, and we're in Treaty 8 territory, and not far down the road from Treaty 11 neighbors who may be with us tonight. So, welcome.
It's great to see. It's great to see. Oh, I heard something. There we go. It's great to see all the seats filled up down here. If you are speaking with people in Yellowknife, it would be good to let them know that we still have seating up here. So if a company still wants to join us tonight, there's still lots of room. Today we're asking, are we doing enough for reconciliation? One of my connections to this is that I cover the TRC work in Chesterfield Inlet and in Rankin Inlet back in 2011, my home territory of Nunavut. And now it's been 3 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued those 94 calls to action, urging Canadians to work on reconciliation and repair the harm caused by residential schools. Now, some progress has been made. For example, schools in the Northwest Territories teach students about the history of residential schools. However, many of the calls to action remain unfulfilled. Indigenous people remain way overrepresented in Canadian jails and are more likely as children to be removed from their families.
My connection to this work, is in part, I worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 3 years as a statement gatherer, and so any of the work I get to do or the values I bring to this are partly out of respect and out of a sense of responsibility for people whose stories I've heard and who shared with the Commission. Tonight we want to focus on what still needs to be done to work deeply on reconciliation and to heal the harm from Canada's Indian residential school system. For those who cannot be here, as I mentioned, we have a couple of ways. There are people tuned in right now on CBC North Radio 1. As well, you can join us and see what's going on here by way of these cameras on our Facebook page. CBC NWT is our Facebook page. We're broadcasting it live there. We're asking people to use the hashtags Beyond94 and CBC North Asks. Hashtag Beyond94 and hashtag CBC North Asks. For people in the room, we really want to open this up. We're going to hear from our panelists who will guide us with their wisdom and experience, but we also want to hear the wisdom and the perspectives on the floor. And so we're going to ask people, to the best of your ability, to keep your contributions brief and concise as much as that works, something like 5 minutes. We're hesitant to interrupt anybody. That's not what we want to do, but if it comes to it, we can try and help people maybe wrap up their point or come to their question. But the whole plan there is to give as many people as possible an opportunity to contribute.
And we do have 2 mental health supports here in the room, Counselors Donald Prince and William Greenland. If you both can stand and wave to our audience so that people know who you are and can approach you if they need to. So we do thank you both for being here.
We have, as you can tell, invited a panel to lead us in this discussion. We have with us, to my immediate right, on the far right of the table here for you, Marie Wilson, who was one of the 3 commissioners who led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and played a unique role among that team of commissioners, which I'm really grateful that she's with us tonight. She was previously a longtime CBC journalist and ran the joint at CBC North for a long time and was really, as I understand it, the first and was instrumental in pushing for CBC's Northern service to actually be run by Northerners.
And to Marie's right, I'm pleased to introduce to you Lawrence Norbert. He is a former residential school student who established the Grolier Hall Residential School Healing Center, and that became one of 10 alternative dispute resolution pilot projects across Canada, and that formed the basis of the Indian Residential Schools Agreement. Important early work on truth and on reconciliation. He continues to advocate awareness and education of the residential school system as the Sikachik Justice Coordinator. Mr. Lawrence Norbert.
Moving down the line of panelists, we have Carolyn Wozniak with us. Carolyn is a Yellowknife lawyer, works with the firm Dragon Toner, and is a former president of the Northwest Territories Law Society and has been a big part of the legal community's efforts, especially locally, to act and to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Going down the line, we have Casey Koizan, and a plug for the Trailbreaker radio show, which I normally host. I had the chance to interview Casey last week. He's a Tlicho musician and artist, installation artist. He brings, I think, an artist's heart and eye to this consideration of truth and of reconciliation, and he also brings the perspective, his own, of an intergenerational survivor. His father was a student in the residential school system, so we welcome Casey.
And finally, last but not least, is Mr. Francois Paulette. He is Chippewan and Iroquois, a residential school survivor, respected elder, activist, hunter, spiritual leader, and hereditary chief in Fort Fitzgerald. Thank you so much for coming. And we also want to thank you guys for coming to this very important discussion, and our members of the public who are joining us via Facebook Live and who are joining us on CBC North Radio 1. We'll open the floor and our online channels for you to share your reflections, but first, let's hear from the panelists. I'd like to first ask Marie Wilson to share your opening reflection. Marie?
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I really want to acknowledge my fellow panelists, and particularly I want to say a word of particular acknowledgement of Norbert here, because when we talk about Grolier Hall and the court case that came forward from there and the ones that happened all across the country, it is those legal vehicles that led to the obligation on the part of the government and the churches, including the United Church of Canada, which is host to this gathering this evening through the Northern United Place in a way, and to acknowledge what had happened in the residential schools and to come to terms in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which included provision for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that wasn't just an early beginning of a conversation about truth and reconciliation. It was part of the legal framework that forced the larger, longer conversation that we're in the midst of now in our country. And he and many others across the country were really pioneers in that. The question that you've asked, I think, is a really important one. And have we done enough for reconciliation? And I would say two things. First of all, the question needs to be framed on an individual basis. Have you done enough for reconciliation? It isn't just about what has everybody else done. It is also to ask oneself, what have I personally done? What has the place where I work and live done? Have I been an influencer in forcing action there? And part of that question is also, have we done anything at all? Because there are still sectors of our society where nothing has yet happened. Many sectors of our society where the level of awareness is still at ground zero. Many individuals who know nothing about the fact that we even had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, much less where it came from or what its purpose was. So to come back to your question, have we done enough? No, we haven't done enough. We've barely begun. But have we begun? And there I say yes. And one of the things I really want to say right off the hop is I am so appreciative, and not because of past affiliation, but because of this present urgent conversation in our country, that the work of the CBC in creating the online tracking website of Beyond 94, I think is a huge contribution to help all of us, first of all, stay aware of the 94 calls to action, but also pay attention to the progress we're making across the country, and then to bring to bear pressure as we can, either as individuals or through organizations, in those areas where not enough has been done or where nothing at all may have been done. So I think that's an example of something very important that is in place. I think also that there are lots of examples within our community. You referenced in your introductions what the Law Society has done here and is continuing to do. So the first step is to begin to do things that you haven't done before, or to do things that you've done before but in new ways, and to try to figure out how to do that, and to engage Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together in finding the answers to those questions. If you look at the entirety of the 94 calls to action, that's one of the recurring themes you see in every single one of them. It talks about this or that level of government in partnership with, in collaboration with, in association with, in conjunction with, in consultation with. It means quit doing stuff on your own as if you think you know the right answer for someone else. It means stop doing that, because we've built our whole 150-year history around thinking that's a good approach, and it's clearly proven that it's not. So find new ways, find new partnerships, and have proper dialogue and consultation in a meaningful way before you move forward with new solutions. And I think enter it with the kind of courage that we've seen from the survivors. And by that I mean knowing that not everything we try is going to work. Some things are going to fail, some things are going to be wobbly. But have the courage to try these things, to engage in them, as I said already, based on proper consultation, and then course correct. And I think at the same time, pay attention to what our various levels of government are being asked to do, and take up our role as citizens in a very responsible way so that we're holding those levels of government accountable, whether it's the municipal government, whether in communities it's the local band council or an Indigenous organization, whether it's the territorial government. We're lucky here. We all have access to those people who are in positions of authority. We know them, we recognize them, we can call them often, we can stop them on the street, and we can make it understood that these things matter to us and that they are priorities and they are urgent and that we expect action. At the same time, doing those things that we can do ourselves. So the final thing I'll just say is, have we done enough? And it's like, you know, we've all been there in January. You're going to go to the gym and you're going to shed that weight. Well, we're trying to shed 150 years of weight in our country. And you don't do that by going to the gym for the first week and then saying, well, I did that, and so have we done enough yet? You know, we really have to decide we're going to go at things in new ways if we actually expect to make lasting, meaningful changes in our life as a country. Masicho.
Thank you very much, Marie Wilson. And we'll go down the panel here, and I'll ask Lawrence Norbert, who was identified for that important early work he did. And I know before we got together, he was talking about the recent work, the current work he's doing in Sigachik. So, Lawrence Norbert.
Thank you, and just to also acknowledge the traditional territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. I'd like to thank CBC for the invitation, as well as to recognize the Northern United Place. I come from a long family of former students, my parents, my siblings. I have one older daughter that was in the Quechua for a while. I went to both, to Grolier in Inuvik, to Grandin College in Fort Smith, and to Quechua. Went back to Grolier in Inuvik and graduated there. In fact, I shared a room with one of my panel colleagues here down at the other end there, at a Quechua Hall. I won't say what we used to do on Fridays heading out to town. My connection was, as mentioned, was a co-founder of the Grolier Hall Residential School Healing Society, the Healing Circle. We did work in alternative dispute resolution. We did multiple victim witness support service. That was the Paul LaRue trial. We did training workshops for community caregivers and professionals to support residential school survivors. And we laid the foundation for a Western NWT interagency committee. As mentioned, our report on the victim witness support service during the Grolier Hall trial was recognized not only by the Privy Council and other major departments, but it was also it laid the foundation for parts of what came out in the Indian residential school final agreement. I don't know if we're doing enough. I suspect a lot of people may have just looked at the TRC calls to action and may have shelved them. But, thank God we have internet and we can dig into the files and look at them. I know in terms of education, our school in Sigachik is active with on-the-land activities. They've done several trips with the students. In fact, they just finished one last week. They brought students up the Arctic Red River to teach them a bit about trapping. This week, they're going to be teaching them about hunting. Last spring, they brought them on a trip down the Arctic Red. So we have a very active principal that's incorporating all these ideas that are. I don't know if she checked the TRC and said, gee whiz, education, but they're doing that. So, so that's one thing. Language and culture, we have a very active recreation committee with the Sigachik Charter community, and they're doing a lot of the teaching the kids some of the traditional games. And in fact, about 3 weeks ago, I think they had the traditional games championships here in Yellowknife, and guess which little small community came in second overall? The Chief Paul Nadichi School. So so the vision that I can start seeing now is that the next Arctic Winter Games, you may have some of these students, with as athletes for some of those. For those games. I have to pay recognition to Debbie Delancey. She was the former Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services. One of the calls to action that you have here is under health, and that is to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field. Sigachik is 160 people. We don't have any RCMP presence. We don't have a station there. We don't have a full-time nurse. Debbie came up with the idea after meeting a group from Ontario that's doing the same thing of teaching small communities on how to become paraprofessionals in the medical field. And we're trying to start, we're on the way to starting a community-based emergency care pilot project program. And that's to teach people more than first aid, more than wilderness first aid, and it's something that's probably going to be less just underneath LPNs. So after 5 o'clock and on weekends, when there's no health services, if something happens, which it did last winter. We had 2 deaths in a matter of, I think, 3 weeks. And, you know, it's for a community our size, it really affects. So if we have trained people like that, then it's so much better. One of the things that my SAO asked me to draft was a position paper on equity funding, and this goes towards what you call access to justice, and it's for equity funding for community justice programs and recognition of justice coordinators, and basically to combat colonial rule by GNWT justice. If there's another one is equity for Aboriginal people in the legal system. Professionally, I've sent a paper to Aurora College Foundational Review advocating for the School of Community Justice, which would train justice coordinators in the small communities. So there's another action that we're doing. The one I like the most, though, is on 57, and that's calling upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to train their public servants on the history of Aboriginal people, including the history of residential schools. As you're aware, this past November, our Premier issued a red alert saying that there's a reemergence of colonialism in NWT. Respectfully, I had to disagree. I think it's still here. I think it hasn't left. And he said that the conversation of the national dream for Northerners has to start in the House of Commons. And again, I have to disagree with respect that the conversation needs to start here for us in the territories. So, you know, if you have a voice, if you want to find your voice, call your MLA, write a letter to your MLA or Premier or one of the ministers. I think I see one here sitting. Asking, demanding, whatever you want to politely ask, but say, you know, we should have every GNWT take a 4 to 5 day orientation course on the history and legacy of the residential school system in the NWT. Well, you know, they're going to call back and write back and say, well, no, it's too expensive, or it's too cumbersome, we can't do it. But just remind them that the entire GNW staff in the 1980s had to become computer literate. Every GNWT, I can remember I was working for them, our division would go over to a classroom and we had to start learning the computer. And if they come back and further, you know, they further rebuke your statement and say that, well, we need more time to review the recommendations, or to develop educational competencies, or draft a request for proposals, or to conduct a study on racism in the NWT, or any other bureaucratic stalling technique. Just remind them that the Grolier Hall Residential School Healing Circle developed 2 support for the residential school survivors training workshops, which were held in Fort Good Hope in Inuvik, March 1998. I've got them on archive, so we can start there. You know, we can start with our civil servants and work from there, and why stop there? You know, why not for First Nations, if you're negotiating an impact benefits agreement with the companies, you know, say, well, you know, if your people want to work with us, they're going to have to take this course on residential schools. And then we'll start seeing, okay, maybe then we'll start working a little bit more on the TRC. We'll be looking beyond 94. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Norbert, and I will say the minister he was singling out is Glenn Abernathy. Thank you very much for joining us, and there's the guy to write the letter to. We have Carolyn Wozniak joining us as well. I mentioned earlier she's a Yellowknife lawyer and has taken from what I've seen from the outside as part of the legal community very seriously the TRC's calls to action, and so I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
I have what I would describe as first the bad news, then some good news, then the inertia, but I'm going to end on, I think, a note of hope. 10 years ago, when I first came here, and there were immediately obvious problems, there are no alternative sentencing options in the North. It goes from probation to jail very quickly. That is found in the calls to action, so if we've done enough there, the answer is no. Pre-sentence reports in the North. So rather, when you have to deal with someone who's being sentenced in a criminal justice system, what do you learn about that person? What does the judge hear about that person? It doesn't come from the community. It comes from the probation officers. That is also raised in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Has that improved? No. Victimization of Indigenous people in the North, the rates are tremendous. Also in the calls to action, also hasn't changed a whole lot. And when you are a victim of crime, you are much more likely to wind up in conflict with the law. That remains also true, so not really improving there yet either. It's a huge gulf to look out over, and as you deal with the cases one after another, it's very easy to stand at the edge of the cliff and at the edge of the canyon and just look at it, and it looks really big and really deep. And it's very difficult to know how you, as a lawyer, or a probation officer or a single RCMP officer are perhaps going to walk across that, and how you're going to get anywhere and change anything when you're just standing at the edge of the canyon. And you'd have the conversations every once in a while, God, you know what? Why isn't somebody doing something? Why isn't this changing? Why isn't there a sentencing circle? Why aren't there community justice programs? Why isn't there a treatment center there? Why aren't there mental health workers? And it would quickly be well, yeah, gee. And that would be the end of the conversation, and that was about as meaningful as it got. And I don't mean that in necessarily negative way. I think people were overwhelmed often by it. There's a great number of well-meaning, caring, empathetic individuals in the justice system who are overwhelmed, standing at the edge of that canyon. When the calls to action came out, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published as the stories were coming out, as the stories were becoming real, as people were seeing and feeling and understanding some of what had gone on over 150 years and generations, and seeing a bigger picture. And when the calls to action gave some meaningful direction as to where we could go and what could happen next, I do believe those conversations started to change. And the Law Society of the Northwest Territories and the Canadian Bar Association, which is the regulatory and the advocacy, none of that's particularly exciting except for lawyers. Everyone, both sides of the lawyers all got together, and that's a working group of how are we going to respond to the calls to action. And we were all very excited, those of us on the working group. We were, okay, this is it, we're going to make something real happen. And we were meeting regularly for hours and talking. And suddenly we realized that we, as this group, weren't going to be able to do anything impositionally. That if we decided what we were going to do to change these communities, or if we tried to say what these communities needed, that's not really the point. And it occurred to us, as we eventually did recommend, is that our consensus was that the Aboriginal of the Northwest Territories should be contacted and consulted before any concrete action is taken in responding to the calls to action. And that meaningful consultation must include the education of the Law Society and the Canadian Bar Association members on the impacts of Indian residential schools on Aboriginal people. We first need to understand their history and how this history shaped the communities and their legal issues today. So that's our first step, which, while hopeful, does now lead to a bit of inertia where you're going, okay, we really want to respond and we really want to do something, but we need to stop and actually make sure we understand what we're responding to before we take the next step, and make sure that we are educated before we then reach out and purport to start a conversation that we need to understand before we start to have that conversation. And that's, I think, the stage that we're at right now, certainly in the legal community. There's a lot of people who, when they have the conversations, there's now a foundation for that conversation. The calls to action in the TRC have given meaning and given depth to those conversations, but we're still at that point of learning. And there's nothing wrong with that, but at least now I can say to you, when someone says, well, why isn't this or this or this happening? I can say, well, we're getting there now. Now we're actually talking about how we're going to get across the canyon that's opened up in front of us. And there are some initiatives. I was fortunate to participate in a meeting with a chief and council and ranking member of the court system, where we attended to have a conversation about what other steps we could take and what could we do next. And the court side, the justice side, we were sitting there talking about the things we might do to tweak the sentencing process and to change the kind of sentencing options and how the conditions would look. And the community was talking to us about the need for healing and the need for treatment and the need for mental health systems. And we were all talking about the same problems, but we were still talking in different ways. So at least we were having the conversation now, but we're still not quite talking about the same things. But it also speaks to something that, Maria, you touched on, that, again, every time you read the calls to action, you read them in a different way. We needed to collaborate. So it's not just about the justice system. So a group of lawyers and judges and probation officers alone, we aren't going to solve and get across the canyon, because we need mental health workers, we need nurses, we need the doctors, we need the child and family services workers, we need all of those people also involved to help us get across the problems we're seeing trickling into the criminal justice system. So it's a recognition, as you're saying, that we have to be talking and you have to be collaborating. There has to be a lot of conversations going on from a lot of different perspectives. So there is some inertia right now, but I think we're getting over that hump and we're starting to have a more meaningful conversation. And so that's the point of hope that I would get to, is that we went from not even really knowing how to have the conversation to having a foundation for having the conversation. And my hope is that when there's enough of us all lined up and standing there and staring at that problem, that we're going to start to have the tools to build the bridge to get us across. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carolyn Wozniak. We're going to go next to Casey Koizan, and I'm coming off an interview with Casey, so I have a sense, I think, of in some ways where he's coming from, but I also I want to recognize that, we've got a perspective from Sigachik, from the legal community, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the media, and we're going to hear from an elder and leader from Fort Fitzgerald. And part of what I'm grateful to have Casey here for is his age and his relationship to the Indian residential school system as an intergenerational survivor, but also an artist's eye and heart and mind. So, Casey Koizan.
Check. You make me feel so young, Loren. So, I didn't come here with any sort of agenda or any specific thing to talk about or to directly acknowledge. When I was asked to come here and do this, I got a voicemail from Loren, and I had to sit on it for a couple hours because I still really don't know what to think about it. I don't like the word. It's a really sensitive subject for a lot of different people, for me as well. And can you turn my mic down, please? Check. I'll get closer if I need to get louder, thanks. So I'm very conflicted about this, about the situation, and I'm very nervous to be here to talk about this. I guess I'll just go from a personal perspective. My dad was in the residential school. He was within the residential school system in Northwest Territories for 3 years. And with what he's told me, and people that are still in the community that I'm friends with and I talk to about, he had a very horrible time in residential school, partly because of his defiance and his skill at hockey, but knowing and how I am, he was probably a pretty cheeky kid when he was young. In recently talking with my dad, we've had a really conflicted relationship kind of throughout my life, and especially, when I was able to discern what's right and wrong. But recently we've been able to really connect and to open up with each other and that sort of thing. And I was able to finally ask him some big questions as to what it was like when he got out of residential school, and he said that with his condition and what he went through, you couldn't tell him what to do. There was just so much alcohol and drug abuse because of what he went through and that sort of thing. And then goes through his life and finds a woman to marry, and they have 2 kids, and now I'm here. My brother is in Cambodia right now. And it's been very interesting growing up with this intergenerational kind of experience for the first part of my life. I didn't even know it was a thing. I was too, I don't know, ignorant as a kid or innocent to really put everything together, but it wasn't really until I moved down to Lethbridge when I was 16 years old that I had my first taste of racism, and it just kept on coming the whole time I was there. So that kind of shifted my whole perspective in terms of reconciliation, or my perspective in life in general. And just growing up with that and kind of learning from that, learning from the experiences and going through, I needed to have my own voice. And throughout playing hockey, it kept on coming in Lethbridge, and then kind of moving back up north and being immersed in the arts world is when I kind of started to not only understand a lot more, but do a lot more research and express myself in a way that, made people think or tried to raise questions. So when we're asked, are we doing enough for reconciliation, there's still a lot of healing to happen, I think, before this question can even be asked. To put a kind of comedic spin on this, I don't know if this was on the air or whatever, but how I thought about when I first saw this question, are we doing enough for reconciliation? Kind of a general question that was put out there, but it's labeled with the CBC. The CBC is funded by the federal government. The federal government is run by Parliament, and at the top of Parliament, we have Mr. Justin Trudeau. And so to me, it's kind of like Justin being like, hey, Casey, are we doing enough for reconciliation? And I'm like, no, man. Give us like 5, 10, 20 years and then ask us the question again, because a lot of us are still healing from these experiences. There's still the elders who went through the residential school system that had these horrible experiences. But at the other end of that, I understand that residential school gave kids everything in what they were talking about. I've heard so much about this college in Fort Smith and what it did for the kids, and it made the leaders of the Northwest Territories. So I understand that on the other end of the spectrum, there is a lot of good in residential schools. But personally, from my experience and that of my father, it's a lot different, right? So to kind of move forward, I was able to accept, I think, for me as a hybrid creature, I'm going to call myself that, half Indigenous, half Caucasian. I feel like there was a lot of responsibility on my part to tread carefully into how I represent myself and my cultures. So yeah. And what I'd like to see, if you're going to ask if there's enough being done for reconciliation, before you can ask that question, thinking the next time you ask that question, there better be options for children in the North, options for Indigenous kids all over Canada to learn their own language, to engage in cultural activities with elders who are willing to teach them, to have more support workers and mental health professionals within our community. I heard just recently that there's mental health workers and counselors being issued throughout the Northwest Territories. Glenn, I'm so glad to hear that. And for me, it's like it's about time, because there's, especially in the smaller communities, like there's a lot less resources. So to have this and have the students be able to access this, but also having the public to be able to access this, I think is huge. And that's one of the first steps that can happen with the healing direction of things. And hopefully that'll help. And I really hope to see more of that in the future. I'll see.
Thank you so much, Casey Koizan. I'm personally glad to hear he's a little bit nervous to be here because I'm glad he's here to share his perspective, as the rest of our panelists as well. It's a very great opportunity, and thank you so much for sharing, Casey. Francois Paulette.
Jag aloitin. Massinursi donitsensi. Rondri nenek jontena nasetesi nenek naikide. Anti ai betsen massinursi. I just want to share some stories with you. I want to first say that at the age of 6 years old, I became a revolutionary when the church stole me from my home. Through the years, it's been tough, but many years ago, my personal path to call for action to decolonize began 44 years ago. I have 2 beautiful wives. One is no longer with us. I have 5 beautiful men, boys, 2 daughters, and 9 beautiful grandchildren. My whole life since 44 has been around decolonization, to become a human being, to become a servant to Mother Earth, to the waters, to the air, to everything that sustained us. Now, to be a servant to the woman, to ensure that they're protected, ensure that our way of life would continue. During the Paulette case, there's only now 2 people that are still living. Since '73, that's Chief Charlie Barnaby from Fort Good Hope and myself. For many of you, you probably would never know this time of our lives. And the Berger inquiry was a huge task for us. I have come a long ways. I wanted just to share a story. In one of my talks, I was in Winnipeg. I was asked to go speak at a racism conference. And I spoke there. And there was these people from Central America that invited me to an event somewhere in Winnipeg, and I did. And they were all from Central America, Indian people. And there was this excitement that somebody was going to attend this. There was a special guest at this evening talk. And finally, after the talk, somebody walked in. I would never forget this sight. Not a very big man in stature. He had fatigues on. He had brown glasses. He looked like a professor. He went up and spoke. He was a revolutionary from Nicaragua, raising money for his revolution. I eventually talked to this man through an interpreter, and what he said stuck with me to this very day. And his whole revolution was to move out the colonizers. And he was raising money to do that. Then he turned to me. He says, "You're a chief." I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Where do you get your money?" I said, "I get my money from the Department of Indian Affairs." He looked at me square in the eye. "Then you will never win," he said. And that is so true. That has never left me. So there's been a lot of commissions in Canada, many commissions. Commissions here in the Northwest Territories of constitutional development, the Paulette case, the treaties. The only thing that's not really gone ahead is the pipeline. When we talk about reconciliation, in my language, Tinayatira, we say when people are attempting to make amends, they say nanalye. Nanalye means take down and start over. If this is what call for action means, then I am there. So, my friends, when I look at what's happening in Canada and in the North, nothing much has changed. When I see First Nations MP getting arrested to protect the waters, the earth, that's not reconciliation. When I see our rivers being dammed at Site C, that is not reconciliation. I follow the path of being a healthy person. At the beginning, I was angry. Today, when I hear the news, I get annoyed. And so my friends, you've asked me to come here. And I'm providing you with the historical past that where our Dene people are. If there is reconciliation based on nation to nation, all of these settlements would be settled. Nation to nation, there will be no such thing as consultation. It would be diplomacy. If it's nation to nation, there will be no derogation clauses in the agreements. It's nation to nation. And we are a long way from that. A long ways from that. This 94 call for action, if you really want to do something about that, take it to the schools. Take it to your workplace. Implement it. One final thing I just want to say. I sat on the hospital board for 7 years to build a healing center. Well, there were 7 men on this board, on this elders council. Then we were disbanded. Then the woman took over. The woman took over. What we have achieved in 1 year, is a long way. They've gone a long way. And I support women's very much in moving ahead. My wife is a good example of midwifery in the Fort Smith area. Decolonization. Let's birth at home. That's where it belongs. We don't have to go to the hospital. That is form of decolonization. So when you talk about reconciliation, that's the first thing that enters my mind is decolonization. If you want to really do it, do it. Like when I get on a plane, I travel a lot. You think this word decolonization or reconciliation enters these passengers on this plane? No. Oh, here's another Indian coming in. Nobody smiles. Nobody says, hello, hello, nice to greet you. They don't greet you. Nothing has changed. They still look at you. You're a passenger, probably getting your money from the Department of Indian Affairs, and you're traveling around. Yeah. So we got a long ways to go. But I live in a bush. I live in a country because I want to retain my identity, my culture, my dinachanya. I want to make my children revolutionaries, more so my grandchildren, so they can continue to pray the way our ancestors prayed long before Columbus came here. You have, all of you have touched me, and I'm not going to go on any longer because I may get too angry. So thank you.
All right. We are going to open the floor now to questions, to comments, to stories. We have a microphone here at center down the aisle. If I could ask, is there anybody who feels ready to step up and to make a contribution, to have something to say that will give us a chance as a room and for something for the panel to, I see Darryl Bolio nodding his head. Mr. Bolio, would you be open to taking the floor first for us? And yeah, okay, great. Well, I'll yammer on the radio here for a moment while you make your way to the microphone. It's about 7 minutes to 8, and that's especially for people that are tuned in on CBC North Radio 1. Really appreciate you being here. One more round of applause, please, for our panel who we've just heard from. Thank you very much. And I will now turn it over to our first contribution from the floor. And even though I've talked to you a bit, maybe you could introduce yourself and then and share the point you'd like. Thank you.
It's no. So, and the elders continually said over and over again, and in my participation on Chief and Council of the Yellowknife Extended First Nation, said, you know, we agreed to share the land and the resources. And they passed down that message. We're getting feedback here. Test. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Got it. So, in the economy of the NWT, we people traded with each other. Then the Europeans came. Then there was the fur trade. And then there was industry. Then the industry came. Indigenous people participated. You either cut logging, or you worked in the mines, did exploration work. And today, we also employ in the diamond mines many people from the communities. And in the last 30 years, I think there's about 70 Indigenous business just servicing the mines. Now, going back to the elders saying we own the land and the resources and we're willing to share it. And when are we going to take advantage or take control, I guess, and saying, let's drive the economy here in the north? And I think that's really critical in the development of the Northwest Territories. So even though there was a lot of issues, in terms of our participation in the economy or whatever economy there was, it never really solved the economic well-being of the communities. And I think George Erasmus put it very well. It's not only the money, it's the social well-being of the community that the economy can bring. At the same time, respecting the land, the environment, and the waters that you're going to, infringe upon. So keeping that all in mind, what do we do now? Somebody once said that we can't monetize complaining, criticism, and condemning. So we have to think, and that's why we're sending a lot of our children to get an education, and education is so critical if you want to be participant in today's economy. And so I sit on the Inspire board. We give out about $14 million a year in scholarships and K-12 programs, etc. But we're very successful. Of that, 86% success rate. But you know what? We're only meeting 6% of the need in Canada. Very, very, very small. So, yes, we're encouraging our students to go to school, get engineering degrees, etc. But at the same time, in terms of business and the economy, as Marie mentioned earlier, what are you doing as an individual to take action? I think each community in the NWT, I think there's over 500 Indigenous business. A lot of them, probably I would say 60 to 70% individually owned. Then each First Nation has a development corporation. Each region has a development corporation. And then there's pan-territorial development corporations like DDC, the Inuvialuit, etc. But what percentage of the economy do they participate in? Very, very, very small. Matter of fact, the majority is in the mining industry, I think. So it's very, very important that these mines have a finite life. Divik's going to end in 5 or 6 years. Gatchokwe, maybe another 10 years. Dominion, we're not sure. But what's after that? So we have to develop a strategy, a strategic plan for our economy, and Indigenous people being 52% of the population. Why can't we have 52% of the economy? Why can't Indigenous people drive the economy here? we're talking about lack of infrastructure. And if we have that infrastructure to generate more economic activity, excuse me, and bring the cost of living down in the communities where you have fly in, fly out, I think if we have corridors such as the Denonation motion a couple of years ago passed in Fort Smith, saying that the Indigenous people should be able to design or pick where the corridors go. They should be able to design those corridors for roads, telecommunications infrastructure, transmission lines, and they should be able to have equity in those pieces of infrastructure. They should be able to build them or participate in that and monitor the environment for as long as that piece of infrastructure is there. So that, I think that's the big actions that can be taken in terms of communities and individuals. I think you need to provide capital to them, seed capital. What's been provided now is not doing the trick. Our office met with Minister Sohi about 2 weeks ago. He can't believe that none of the infrastructure dollars that they provide goes to Indigenous communities. So we need to rock that boat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Daryl Bolio with the Denonday Investment Corporation. Is that right? Denonday Investment Corp? Development Corporation. Okay, thank you. And I wanted to, as people figure out if they would like to contribute or how, I wanted to put some of that to our panel, and in part leaving us with the thought of rocking the boat, but also that kind of at the heart of it, this idea of economic reconciliation. I made eye contact with a few people. So Lawrence, Norbert, if you'd like to go from there. Yeah.
Because I looked at you. Yeah, just because I looked at you. Okay. You know, as generations of children return from residential schools, many of us brought back a burden of shame and trauma. And for many years, we've tried to forget what had happened, to shove our hurt feelings into the background, just so that we could get on with everyday life. And the legacy of residential schools, which still impacts our communities today, includes loss of language, destruction of culture, mistrust of leadership and authority. Sorry, Glenn. Intergenerational sexual abuse, political infighting and undermining. Anybody see that in their communities? Chronic addictions, dependency thinking. I got a problem, I'll let the government solve it. You know, there's still a lot of that thinking going on. Old grudges and long-standing feuds. Anybody have Hatfields and McCoys in their communities? In their small communities where there's one faction fighting with the other for control of the town or control of the elected body. That's still there, the old grudges and long-standing feuds. There's weak and broken bonds of love, trust, and caring, interpersonal violence. I think our lawyer friend knows about that. Lack of initiative and entrepreneurial spirit. Broken families, physical abuse of children and other vulnerable people, personal rage, shame and dysfunction, and spiritual and cultural shame. So that's the big challenge, And for me, one of the big challenges in my job is how do I translate, the 94 calls to action into for the people of 160 people in Sikchik, with no police, with no nurse, how do I translate that hope of the 94 calls to action? How do I translate that to them? So, when we start talking about economic reconciliation and communities and land claim bodies wanting to take control of what's happening up here, I think we still got a lot of stuff we have to do at home, and one of them that, like when we have a lot of old grudges and long-standing feuds, is we have to make peace with each other in our communities. It's just, to me, there's just no way unless we do that. I don't think we can even start thinking of of beyond 94. And we started that about 4 years ago. We had a Making Peace in Sigachik in lieu of anti-bullying day. The principal and I were planning the anti-bullying, and we were, like the question came up, well, why do we have to be against something? Why can't we be for something? So instead of anti-bullying, why can't we be for peace? Making peace with each other in our community. And I got some of the posters here, and I got some of the buttons, Making Peace in Sigachik. It's an uphill battle. 4 years, I don't know if things have changed in our community, but, hopefully, the students who signed the banner, and it hangs, in our school, but they signed it with believing that if we can make peace with each other, maybe we can move ahead. Just maybe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Norbert. We're going to go to Francois Paulette now, and I'm interested in whatever he has to say, but also stitching together these ideas that you mentioned in your language of take it down and start again, and what Darrell raised about economic reconciliation.
When we were negotiating our settlement in Fitzgerald area, we consciously really looked at lands that were both spiritually, culturally, economically viable. And we picked lands that were in Fitzgerald. There's titanium on our land. South of there's oil and gas. We ensured that. So they're there. But today, clean energy, we must capture energy from electricity, from the sun, the wind. We need to do that. Because of global warming, climate change, our whole lifestyle is changing so rapidly. We can't keep up to it. We need to look at food security. Food security in our territory is buffalo. We don't have the buffaloes we have. We can ranch buffalo. We can put them. We have beautiful territory for that. We need to do a lot of work, research on the water, the health of the water that's being contaminated by the tar sands. We have so much to do. But the big ticket from where I am, and we're sitting on a gold mine, is tourism. The tourist trade there is beautiful. If you ever want to come to my territory, and I will show you the river. That river in the rapids there, I took my wife there, and she looked at this beautiful rapids, the island. There's about 15 islands. You see animals, bears, moose, lots of medicines. And when we got home, he says, well, she's the boss. She says, my husband, we are going to buy a boat. I want to travel that river more than once. So she bought a boat, a flat river boat, 18 foot. Now we can go through the rapids like no problem. But it's so beautiful there, She goes back there, I go with her, I take my children, I take whomever that wants to travel that river. But if our First Nation was to really get into that big time, everybody would be working. Right now, Fort Smith, everybody works. The town is not short of work. There's a lot of work there. We can't complain that there is no work in Fort Smith. There is a lot of work. So we'll leave the titanium in the ground. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francois Paulette. I see lots of educators, I see lots of people of different ages and careers and backgrounds and interests and perspectives. So I'd encourage maybe people, if you don't mind, if you're interested in speaking and sharing a perspective, if one or two at a time you could make your way to the microphone. It's the best way for us to kind of know that you want to share something. We are having some contributions now online. I'll just remind people that the hashtags are Beyond94 and CBC North Asks. And we're broadcasting this live right now on Facebook. And we're getting contributions from people all over. So I apologize for looking at my phone and scrolling through things. It may look like I'm texting or something, but I'm in touch over here with Garrett Hinchy, who's our social media editor, and he's sending me some of this stuff. From Christine Taylor Zigwanskwe, peace, it starts with our healing, as Casey said, then come and ask what can be done. We are healing, and all that is spoken of at this moment is absolutely true as well. We need to let our people begin our healing, and the means and ways, etc., need to be honored and protected. From Joachim Bonnet Rouge in Fort Providence, Joachim, thank you for being in touch. Deal with addictions in communities first. And I should say that Joachim had caps lock on that for that. So, Kalinda Blondin, entrepreneurship and creativity, hope and confidence. We have more reflections coming in, but I want to give the panel and others an opportunity to respond or reflect on what they've heard so far, whether it's economic reconciliation or something that came in by way of social media. Marie Wilson.
I'll just offer a couple of comments from the questions online, but also some of the comments from the panelists. Just, when the Commission receives statements, and my perspective is from right across the country, we recorded almost 7,000 statements. And about 90% of those, by my own personal tracking of the statements I heard, people talked about addictions of alcohol and or drugs as having been part of their reality after residential school, and some of them indeed starting in residential school. So it's a huge issue, there's no question of that, and it breeds, as many people have told us, a kind of its own culture of addiction that then plays out within families. And so the issue of intergenerational impacts is a huge one that we all have to understand, and especially anybody that wants to think that the residential school period is over and therefore let's move on, or any expectation that that's a straightforward or easy thing to do. So I think we have to be aware of that, and many people also talked about, and this is to the point of economic potential and possibility, about their ability to get post-secondary education, first of all, because it's not readily geographically nearby, but also because they were so traumatized in school that they were not able to learn well. They couldn't learn in that environment, and so they felt that they didn't come out with a good education. And that's before we talk about the number of children who have ended up being raised in the child welfare system because their parents came home from residential schools. And this is not the case for everyone, but many who talked about being unable to parent in a healthy way because of the way that they were raised. We heard over and over and over again about parents who felt that they were still learning how to be good parents or had never figured that out till they were well on in their own lives. So I think all of these issues become then interrelated. And so what we've heard already about the importance of investing in young people, and assuming, not making the mistake of assuming that Indigenous children already know all this stuff. A lot of families were not able to talk about it internally, and the children themselves didn't know what had happened in their families or why things were the way they were. So we have to be really cautious about making assumptions that, first of all, it's over. It's a long, long ways from being over in terms of the active impacts. And yes, there's an incredible need for healing. We talked about it in our interim report, and there is a reason why we were very specific in saying, in particular, there's a need for healing centers and programs in the Northern Territories. This territory here had one of the longest running periods of residential schools in the entire country. And we know that what we heard from survivors from the northern region is extremely concentrated. Because of those 7,000 statements, 1,000 of those statements came from Northern Canada. It's a very high percentage, so the accuracy of the read of what's needed and what's missing is well supported by the expertise of the survivors who spoke to us, and that is their expertise, their lived experiences. So I think we have to address economic reconciliation as a social issue as well as a job creation issue, and I also totally agree that we have to also talk about it as a place and an identity issue. Where does one's identity fit with Mother Earth? We heard many people talk to us about the harms that they experienced in residential school, and one of those was rupture from home and family, but for many that was also rupture from home and land, and their sense of being tied to their homelands and knowing who they are. So there's work to be done on all those fronts. I don't think it's linear. I don't think you start here and then you do this and then you do this and then you do this. I think we need to start many places at the same time, and we need to work at things in a holistic way and just move forward and hold up the good examples of where good things are happening so that we can stay encouraged and so that others can be inspired by the good efforts that are being made and things that are making small difference, even though it's inching forward when we might wish it could be much more rapid.
1212. Thank you so much for that, Marie. And just a reminder, we're hearing some some talk that might bring back some memories for people that are around the room. And again, I just want to remind people that we do have 2 mental health support counselors here, Donald Prince and William Greenland. So please feel free to speak with them if you need to. Okay, let's move on to our floor here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Lois Little. I live here in Yellowknife and have for a long time. I want to thank the panel, I think, for your wise words and inspiring words, and thanks CBC for putting this on. Francois's decolonization word really resonates with me, and I think that that's at the heart of building new relationships. And I think as Lawrence and I go back a long way, we tried back in the 70s to spark a bit of a decolonization movement around self-government. And we were fired from the government for doing that. And you know, there's been lots of movements to try and engage people in conversation, to build new relationships, to take down the old colonial structures, as you're saying, Francois, and build something new that works for us here in the North. And you know, when Lawrence was mentioning the red alert that was issued last fall or whenever it was, you know, it missed the mark so widely in that it ignored the possibility of having some discussions here, conversations here, building relationships, new relationships in the North. And so I guess that's what I see as my responsibility as a resident here, is to try and poke and prod at conversation across all kinds of old barriers and boundaries to try and build those new relationships and create a new North and a new future for the North that involves everybody. And I guess I'm seeing a lot of resistance from the old entrenched government structures, in particular, the institutional structures. No one wants to give up power, but we have to change the power dynamics. We have to decolonize. And the only way we can do that is talk to each other, agree to work together, and share power. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. I think I have some meaningful contributions online, but we are starting to see a queue, which is wonderful here in at Northern United Place in Yellowknife with our live audience. And so we'll stay in the building. We'll stay in this room for now, and I'll ask our next contributor to introduce himself and make whatever reflection or comment he'd like.
Yeah, excuse me. My name is Roy Erasmus, and I'm a member of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. I didn't go to residential school. My dad did, so I guess I'm what you call an intergenerational survivor. And I really like what the people said up here. You know, you all come from different areas and different viewpoints. Very good. Francois had said, I can't remember the word that he used, but he said it means to take down and start over. Well, I think that is very, very true in this instance. I think we need to basically take down a lot of stuff and start over. I'll give you some examples. Somebody talked about the treaties earlier. And of course, land claims and self-government agreements are modern day treaties. But as we've heard recently, a lot of us have known, but other people haven't known. When we negotiate those agreements, the land claim agreements, we have to borrow money from the federal government. And some of us owe like $20 million or something. And if you're going to get $50 million in your agreement and you got to give $20 million back to the federal government, that's not much of an agreement, is it? So, you know, we could start there. It's a good place to start. And I'm really glad to hear the federal government is actually thinking of not making Indigenous groups borrow money for land claims and possibly even forgive the amounts that are racked up from the past. We have a lady up there who's from the legal community. Well, we could start there as well. The courts are built on precedents, the system. Until 1960 or so, us Indigenous people, we couldn't even be legally represented in courts in various matters. So the whole darn system is built without our participation. And it's all built on precedent, so things today are still being judged, and decisions are coming based on things way, way back when we weren't even allowed to have a lawyer. And in the area of education, this is really big, because we have the Indigenous population in the Northwest Territories, as well as across Canada, are for the most part very poorly educated. We need to pour millions of dollars into this system. I know the Department of Education is working on renewal right now. But you can build the best system in the world, but if they don't have enough money to implement it, it's not going to work. And I'm saying this because it's mostly in the smaller communities where where it's the worst. We have a hard time keeping teachers in the communities, and part of that is because there isn't proper housing for teachers. But it's not only that, people don't want to stay in isolated communities and that, so there's a huge turnover in staff. So these kinds of things have to be worked on, but also we have to get the parents engaged in their kids' educations. And I worked in education a while back, and we had started working on that. That has to be put into place again and really, really done. Because we can't just say educators' job is to teach in a school and that's it. I think we need to ensure that they're also working on community engagement and getting the parents engaged in their children's education. Has to be done by the Department of Education, in my view. Government staff. We've had affirmative action here for I don't know how long. The goal has been to get a 50% Aboriginal or Indigenous participation in the government, because we have approximately 50% Indigenous people here. But it's been stuck at 33% forever. So you'd think that the government would take the hint and do something. They should have a unit in the Department of Human Resources that's specifically trained and there to help Indigenous people get into the workforce. That is so needed, otherwise it's just not going to happen. It's so easy for managers who are in the hiring system not to hire Indigenous people. I know, because I was a senior manager for 12 years in a territorial government, and it's very easy to do that. I had to fight it a lot. And I have to agree with Lawrence about the GNWT staff getting 3 to 5 days training on Indigenous cultures. That is very, very needed. People come up here, they don't know very much. Some people don't know anything. And we hire people a lot of times. They're here for a couple months, 6 months, they're gone. They can't stand it. So we need to have that. It's very, very important so that people that are making decisions about Indigenous people up here all the time, they know the context. Finally, in the area of healing, which is the area I'm working in now, so it's my contribution to reconciliation. We really, really need counselors. We need more counselors, and we need access to counselors. Right now, the Government of Canada has just renewed a program where people can get counseling, but it's only for 3 years. And there are not very many Aboriginal counselors on that list. They're primarily non-Aboriginal. So we need to get more Aboriginal counselors trained and access. People need access to them as well as to the other counselors. So there has to be, the GNWT and the federal governments need to work together to implement this. It seems like they do a little bit in one area and the other guys do a little on the other. They need to get together to make sure that these programs are available to more people. And I forgot one thing when I was talking about the courts. we need to have more Indigenous lawyers. There has to be something put in place so that there's more Indigenous lawyers coming through the system and getting into onto the bench. Because from what I understand up here, there are no Aboriginal judges. Maybe I'm wrong, but we need more people in the legal system that are lawyers and judges, Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Erasmus. Now, we got half an hour left, but in a weird way, it's surprisingly close to the end. So I definitely want to make sure we hear from Gia. After that, I'm going to share a couple of perspectives from online that I think are meaningful and that may give some panelists something to kind of dig into. And then I think, depending on how quickly we're going here, we're going to give panelists a brief opportunity to have a closing reflection, and that will get us very close. So we'll hustle, and if I could ask contributors to keep it to one point that's especially important to you. I know there is a ton to this, but that would be wonderful. Please, if you'd introduce yourself and shoot.
All right, hello. Nagadagon di nalo tong suje Gia Zentu. I speak neither of my languages, so I hope that somehow conveyed respect. So I was recently down in Ottawa for the National Center for Collaboration in Indigenous Education's National Conference, talking about Indigenous education and what's being done across the country. And I was talking to educators, particularly the language educators, and there's so much work being done across the country. There's so much work and so much knowledge and passion from the teachers, but everyone was very, very frustrated with how limited, how they had to work within these really tight constraints of the colonial system. And I mean, here in the territory, our language rates are declining. People aren't speaking it anymore. It's dying out. And so I just kind of want to know what place Indigenous languages has going forward 5, 10, 20 years, what place it has in the colonial system, if it even belongs in the colonial system, and what's going to be done to grow our languages. Is that going to be valued? Is that going to be important? And what's the next step for that?
I'm going to capture that question, if it's okay, and bring it back as we give a chance to panelists to close out, because I want to try and squeeze in some more points. But Gia, I'll raise that again, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Thank you.
Marcy Cho. Suzy Nolene Vilbrin Hushera. Tatanot ina den aslina. Alnu sayati yashira. Ya dyna har quen nathi ya lera. Hat oli allu sayati yashira. Sit hunt I sit here bet are sayati yashira. Basically, what I said in my language was, my name is Nolene Vilbrin. I'm a not a Denesolina, I'm a Tatanot Ina. Tatanot Ina means copper Indian, Yellowknife Indian. And that's the language that I speak, and that's the language that is not being spoken today or identified. So when you speak about language, I did learn a bit why our language is not being spoken here. Number one, when you make agreements, not nation to nation as was mentioned, but you are pushed through a modern agreement where the clause says there in simple English that the Dene, or the people in the Sawtoo, the Gwich'in, the Tlincho, there's still 2 outstanding in this region that have not agreed to surrender or cede. This is what those modern agreements are doing, are ceding and surrendering. So when you cede and surrendering to a public government, that public government now has the authority. But not only that, this public government's language is French and English. So you don't even recognize our own languages in your corporation because Canada is incorporated. We know that. And that's what's going on here today. The healing. How can the people go out on the land and reconcile when the government's policies and rules is to get rid of? We can't get rid of what's here. Why? For the simple fact, we existed. The Dene were here. We had Dene law. Does this lawyer know about Dene law? No, she only knows the corporation law, and that's what's missing. We are being pushed into a colonial system, whether it's in the justice system, whether it's the education, or whether it's health or housing. How can our people meet the criteria of public housing? We are getting evicted for non-payment of taxes when the Queen's Bargain, not a treaty, but the Queen's Bargain of 1835, the Renew Bargain, to our people here specifically said, we are not to pay taxes. If the whites crowd you, you are to go to the superintendent and they are to be prosecuted. So why is my family being evicted? That's what I'd like to know. How do you reconcile that? You can't, unless you change the rules. And I don't think society wants to change the rules because right now we know who has control, and that's the Canadian law. We never ceded nor surrendered. And that goes to the children. I am a survivor. I went to residential school. I did everything in my power to help bridge gaps. I sat with Lawrence Norberg. I did a lot of things. But my grandmother, our beliefs are we don't brag about what you do for others. You do it because you do it from the goodness of your heart. Those are the traditions, practices, and beliefs that are not in the corporations that are serving us in way of contracts. And this is why I take a stand, and this is why I'm kicked out of meetings. Because I stand up for the babies. I stand up for the women. I don't see any women, Dene women up here. I don't see no Dene women that are counselors to help the rest of us Dene women. If we need help, it's the male. So there's an imbalance. Until that is fixed and there's equality. And this is why I want to read something here I thought was so profound. And this is from Elijah Harper. And I've had the opportunity to sit as a panel with Elijah Harper to speak about treaties, what is and is not there. The Aboriginal justice system. With so much discrimination occurring against our people, it is often amazing how accepting we are of our situation. We know that without tolerance, there can be no justice. And society has never been tolerant of us, but intolerant. And that's why we're in jails. That's why our children are taken and contracted out, because the support is not for the families. It's not for the women. The government took down our teepees, but they won't support the women to bring the babies and the families back through the 94 points of reconciliation. Without equality, there can be no justice. With justice, we can begin to understand each other. With justice, we can work and live with each other. With justice, we can love and feel. We can feel confident with each other. Aboriginal people want a judicial system that recognizes the native way of life, our own values and beliefs and traditions, and not the white man's way of life. And this is where it comes to Dene law. This is the one thing that I did learn, that Dene law supersedes domestic law, which is the Supreme Court of Canada. Dene law also supersedes international law. But yet, the government created these 3 autonomous governments. And what is the 3rd autonomous government? The First Nations? All the chiefs are signing to cede and surrender with the territorial government. And they find out later. Now the people. How can you reconcile the people to the land or to the services? It's very difficult. But the one thing I do know, Dene people and our ancestors have never, ever given up the land, or is it in our vocabulary in Dene? It isn't. Ask Francois. Except there is Dene Chani. That's how a person should live, is the right way. And that's how we are all supposed to live and support one another. This Canada's institution is only a middleman. They are there to deliver programs and services because our ancestors couldn't speak English or couldn't write in English. But I think we are of age now that we do have a comprehension level. And you know what? We definitely don't need any more Aboriginal lawyers who are also putting our people in jail, because the system is not for our people. The system is for the civilian law. So, as a one Dene woman, I don't think we can see reconciliation until this government quits ceding and surrendering in their documents. And that's all I have to say. Marcy Cho.
Thank you very much. That was Nolene Villebrun, and a powerful point. I think we're going to leave it from the floor. We're going to give our panelists an opportunity to be back involved. We won't get through the rest of the perspectives in the live broadcast, but we don't have to break apart. The Yellowknives Dene drummers are going to join us. There's also an opportunity here on the back of the program that's in front of you. But I want to, we've heard a number of things, and Nolene made a number of points, among them a point about language, what is being spoken here and in Sambuk A right now, and we heard something similar, and a question about that from Gia, who contributed before. So I also have some online questions, and I'm going to throw it back to the panel, and maybe Marie, with your permission, I'll begin with you.
Okay. I'll pick up on the point of language specifically. Just to recall one of the survivors, I've never forgotten this point. They said, you know, what the schools did to us in forbidding the use of our languages, not only did they take away our ability to speak our language, but they also took away our belief in the importance of our languages. And I know that for especially many of the older generation of residential school survivors, I know I've experienced that in our own extended family, big resistance on the part of many in the older generation to teach their children or to pass it forward. And also many who had such traumatic experiences specifically associated with speaking Indigenous languages. I remember someone saying, I can hear the words, I know they're there, but they choke in my throat because I'm waiting to get hit on the back of the head. So that idea of falling in love with language and realizing its importance and its beauty and its depth is something that also has to be reclaimed, I think, for the speaker. I think there are more speakers in our midst than we know, because there are many people who can speak but don't speak. And so I want to say that. I do want to say, though, and I'm not trying to put happy spin on things, but I think we do have to be aware of and acknowledge work that's being done. And I am aware that there has been a lot of consultation across the country on the issue of Indigenous languages. Our calls to action that talk about the creation of official language status for Indigenous languages. There is legislative work underway as we speak towards that, and hopefully having official status will be an important trigger towards getting resources allocated. There are a lot of examples across the country as well where there are, for example, childcare, early childhood education, daycare, language nests, many of them who accept children only if there is also an adult non-speaker who comes with them, so that the child and the adult can learn at the same time, which gives a possibility for children to speak at home with their learning adults. And there are some wonderful examples of that happening in various parts of the country. And I really hope we will be bold and do some of that here. So that's what I want to say in the language. And I do just want to say very, very quickly on the law front, and I know it's very slow, but I am aware that at McGill University specifically, they are introducing a third stream in their law school where they already do common law and civil law, and they are introducing a Indigenous law framework in their law school. It's being led by a lawyer from Couchiching, among others. So it's a start, and hopefully there'll be a lot more of that to come.
I see Francois raising his hand, but I think we're going to go down the table, and Francois will give you an opportunity for sure. We do need to hustle a little bit for the purposes of the broadcast.
We have about 14 minutes left before the top of the hour. Lawrence, if you wouldn't mind giving us your closing comments, if you can do that and do it briefly with all due respect.
I think a lot of what's happening here, and I hope to see it as we look beyond 94. And I think it was your fellow commissioner who, I think in one interview, said, I don't think I'll be able to see reconciliation in my lifetime. Maybe it'll be further down the road, but, you know, there's a lot of things have happened, you know, and but the one thing I remember when I was still working with GNWT Justice, and I was assigned to help the Chesterfield Inlet residential school survivors. And what a marvelous demonstration in finding your voice. You just see these former students telling the government people, telling the churches, you are not going to tell us how to heal. You are not going to tell us how we are going to, you know, to do victim services for our people, for our survivors. And, you know, you could just see the government people and church people just shrinking, you know, because they never, I don't know if they've seen this before or heard this, people finding their voices. One of the movies I really started liking lately, and for those of you who went to residential schools, you look forward to Friday or Saturday night, because for about 2 or 3 hours you had a movie night and you were transported out of the residential school for that many time. In the 2010 motion picture, The King's Speech, speech therapist Lionel Logue goads King George VI, who has a stammer, for those of you who've seen the movie. And, you know, Bertie, that's the king's name, is trying to get Lionel to listen to me. And Lionel says, listen to you by what right? And the king says, divine right, if you must, I'm your king. Lionel says, no, you're not. Told me yourself. You said you didn't want it. So why should I waste my time listening to you? And the king just explodes, you know. Because I have a right to be heard. I have a voice. And I think this is what former residential school students, those who were in the 10 pilot projects, those who started the early work, some of the national leaders at the time, the women, you have the Me Too movement. People are starting to find their voice. And government and churches are scurrying now. They're just wondering what's going on. The men are scurrying, you know, as Francois, you know, we're trying to figure this out too, because people are finding their voices. And if you look at the 94 recommendations, calls to action, I think I like that term better than recommendations, but they're calls to action. Not to think, not to study, sorry, government people I know like that. But these are action items. So if you can find your voice, if you can demand to be heard, you have a right to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence Norbert. Carolyn Wasnett.
Just quickly to answer the question about judges in the north, out of the 8, and on the Superior Court panel, we do have 1 judge born and raised in Fort Good Hope who is Indigenous, which is something to be very proud of, but it is only 1 out of 8. The law is often very constraining. It is often very restrictive. It often seems very black and white, but a good lawyer doesn't see it that way. A good lawyer does not see it as black and white. A good lawyer will see that it is gray. And it is precedent-based, which means every single case has the chance to be decided differently. Because although you're building up on what has happened in the past, every single case is new, and every single time a judge can actually take what is in the past, look at it and say, well, yeah, you know what? But today in these circumstances, I'm going to reinterpret it. And the Canadian Constitution was described as Supreme Court of Canada as being a living tree, which means although it has deep roots, it is always changing and always growing. So it's a privilege to be a lawyer, and you have to take an ethical obligation as a lawyer that if you see an unjust law, you're supposed to stand up and do something about it. So I don't see why Indigenous traditions and Indigenous laws can't start to be part of the Canadian legal fabric. There's no reason. It's a living tree, and it's growing and it's changing, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't start to bring that forward.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I'll throw to Casey Koizan. We're tight for time, but I did want to say that we got a question online specifically for you, and it was about the place, the reflection for you on arts in healing and in reconciliation. But you make the closing statement that you'd like. I just wanted to raise that. That came from Chief Ladybird, and she said,
Oh, wow, cool. I didn't bring any sort of closing statement or anything like that. I see a lineup of people and I want to hear from them. So if I can just pass my time on to them and then just go straight to him. I'd really want to hear from the people. Like, they came out here to talk, yeah. So I'll just pass. Respect. Yeah, I'll talk to her personally, maybe.
Very good. Thank you, Casey. We'll go to Francois Paulette. We're going to have a closing. We're going to have drummers, but for the broadcast, we'll have to hit a mark. After that, we don't need to run away. We can do this together. Francois Paulette.
Thank you. Language is going to be legislated in about 2 years. I'm going to go back to this nation to nation. If we were working on that bilateral, treaties are paramount. We don't really need legislation to carry out our laws, as Nolene was expressing. But that's going to take 2 years. But now they're going to legislate pot or cannabis or marijuana. Now, how many of you smoke marijuana here? Lift up your arms. Come on. Well, you're the minority. Anyway, just think about legislation. Like, to legislate marijuana took maybe a couple of years. But to legislate language is going to take forever. If they're going to legislate language, I hope that the monies that are going to be controlled by the Denny here in the north, I do not want it to go to the territorial government. Capiche? Thank you.
All right, we are, we have parallel things happening here. We're broadcasting on Facebook and on YouTube, and we're broadcasting on CBC North Radio 1, and we're also having a gathering here together for all the people in the room. And I really do appreciate our panelists. We're going to say some thank yous. We're going to have the drummers join us, and that will conclude our CBC North Radio 1 broadcast. And then I think we'll make some decisions as a group about how we close this, who we hear from. But we're not kicked out of here. We're going to have some drumming. We're going to have, the snacks are still here. I also got a message while we were speaking from our managing editor, Mervyn Brass, who's with us here, who said, please announce that CBC North will have more reconciliation events. This discussion is important to the territory, to people, obviously. And so we're at a moment, and we have to kind of deal with that, but we'll keep going.
Very important discussions, and we appreciate everybody's participation, and especially the panelists and people who have come up to the mic. It's been very much appreciated. We do want to thank our CBC North colleagues who have made this town hall happen this evening. Our technical broadcast team, we have, as well as our support team, we have Daryl Eros, Radek Adam, Chantal DeBook, Matthew Martin, Kevin Woodlum, Francis Guanezo, and Derek Thuat. Thank you so much, CBC staff. And I'm going to pass it on to Loren to say a few more thank yous.
Very good. We also want to say thank you to Garrett Hinchy, our social media editor. Thanks to our communications team and staff, Galen Poulin, Jane Tran, Keisha Pin. This CBC North Town Hall was produced by Marilyn Roback, who is with us. Thank you very much, Marilyn. As well, our managing editor. Yep, Marilyn deserves a round of applause for sure. I'll keep saying thank yous, but I want to invite the Yellowknives Dene First Nation drummers to the front to ready yourselves. Come join us, please. Mervyn Brass, as I mentioned, is our managing editor and is leading us in some ways through his own relationship with this question of reconciliation. Janice Stein is our managing director. We have CBC reporters and producers here who are working. Jamie Malbuff, Peter Sheldon's back at the plant. That means tomorrow on the radio, tomorrow on our website, cbc.ca/north, tomorrow on the television, we will continue this conversation. We'll continue to reflect on these questions and on your contributions. We have this sheet that everybody has. Please do leave us your thoughts. We would appreciate it. A huge thank you to the group that has led and guided this decision. Francois Paulette, Casey Koizan, Carolyn Wozniak, Lawrence Norbert, and Marie Wilson. We're grateful to have them here. Yeah. Finally, thank you very much to the audience online. Thank you very much to the audience on CBC North Radio 1, and thank you very much to the audience and contributors here in the room. The Yellowknives Dene drummers are going to play out our radio broadcast, and I've got a gesture from Felix Lockhart, which I appreciate, to have us all stand and close this out. Thank you, Masi, Koana, Marcy Cho. Really appreciate it. A little bit of language in this room.